When we last left off, we saw that Heathcliff had returned to the area from parts unknown and wreaked havoc on the Linton household. He's eloped with Edgar's sister, Isabella, and has brought about a mental breakdown in Catherine. The doctor has said that Catherine is now basically a shell of her former self. Her physical strength has returned in a measure, but her reasoning has been damaged to a point that he thinks is beyond repair. We've also learned throughout all of this that she's pregnant. Perfect timing, right? Mental breakdown, you're going to be a mother. But Heathcliff still can't stay away. He always seems to be prowling about, waiting for Edgar to leave the house, even for just 5 minutes, so that he can have a chance to see Catherine, and he finally does get his chance. Despite Nellie pleading with him to leave the family alone, he comes in while Edgar is at church, and he gets to have one last meeting with the woman that he loves. So they embrace passionately, and they weep together, but at the same time, Kathy accuses him. She says, "You and Edgar broke my heart. It's your fault I'm like this, and I won't pity you." And she goes on to voice her doubt of the constancy of his love, saying that once she's dead, 20 years from now, he'll just think back on her as an old attachment, but he'll make plenty of new friends and maybe even start a new family in the meantime. He won't really miss her. Now, we know from speeches that Heathcliff has already made that this is unlikely. And maybe Kathy knows that it's unlikely too, and she's just saying it to be vindictive, to twist the dagger in. But then Heathcliff accuses her of being a traitor to her own heart and to her own feelings. He says that the mess that she's in is her fault for marrying Edgar when she really loved him, Heathcliff. He says, "You teach me now how cruel you've been. Cruel and false. Why did you despise me? Why did you betray your own heart, Kathy? I have not one word of comfort. You deserve this. You have killed yourself. Yes, you may kiss me and cry and wring out my kisses and tears. They'll blight you. They'll damn you. You loved me. Then what right had you to leave me? What right, answer me, for the poor fancy you felt for Linton? Because misery and degradation and death and nothing that God or Satan could inflict would have parted us, you of your own will did it. I have not broken your heart, you have broken it, and in breaking it you have broken mine. So much the worse for me that I am stronger. Do I want to live? What kind of living will it be when you, oh God, would you like to live with your soul in the grave?" So we'll come back to this language about his soul being in a grave in just a minute. But he turns it right back on her. He says, if this is anybody's fault, it's yours. You weren't true to your own heart. You loved me. You should have married me. Meanwhile, Edgar comes home. Kathy is clinging to Heathcliff. She won't leave him, even though he actually tries to go at this point. And she finally faints in his arms. This last shock of seeing Heathcliff again has proven to be too much for her. So while Heathcliff waits out in the garden all night, Catherine dies while giving premature birth to her daughter. This daughter is also named Catherine, and Nellie tells us that she entered into the world friendless because everyone was too distraught over her mother's death. And it's Nellie who has to break the news to Heathcliff. And as he hears about Kathy's death and he breaks down sobbing, Nellie thinks to herself, here's a poor wretch with a heart just like his fellow men. And this is interesting because we've seen that characterizations of Heathcliff so far have vacillated between something flesh and blood and something supernatural. We've seen the human side of him and his passion for Kathy, but other characters think of him as a devil, an imp, or a wolf, as we've mentioned before. But in this moment of grief, Nellie's reminded that in spite of how wicked he's been, in spite of how mischievous, how troublesome, he's still a human being with human emotions. And that core element of what it is to be a human being is still there no matter how much he tries to harden his heart. Maybe we can imagine ourselves in Heathcliff's position. The world has been a friendless place, and he's come to believe that the only way to get ahead in life is to be ruthless, exacting, and vindictive. Maybe he's even looked back on his past self, the degraded farm boy kept in ignorance, who's jilted by his love for the neighborhood squire, and he's looked back on all that with disgust for the open emotions that he showed then. So he probably thinks of himself as being someone above such feelings and weaknesses at this point, that he's probably seared his conscience with a hot iron, as the scripture says. But now, this extreme loss has broken down the barriers. And this is why Nellie mentions that his pride has forced God to wring a cry of humiliation out of him. It's to show him that he is still human. Then we come to the invocation of Catherine's spirit. Heathcliff says something that's kind of similar to what Victor Frankenstein said over the graves of his wife and family members. He implores their spirits, you'll remember, to rise up and assist him in his quest to pursue the creature to the Arctic. Heathcliff invokes Cathy's spirit as well. But in this novel, such an act has more relevance in light of what we've already read about Cathy's ghost in the opening chapters, as well of comments that Cathy made herself about preferring the moors to being in heaven. Nellie sort of says the traditional thing to say, which is that I hope that her soul finds peace in the afterlife, that it finds peace in heaven. And Heathcliff says, may she wake in torment. Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, and here he starts talking to Cathy. He says, oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer, I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers. I believe, I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always, take any form, drive me mad, only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you. O God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul. He dashed his head against the knotted trunk, and lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast getting goaded to death with knives and spears. And of course, we finish off there with another example of someone being driven to a bestial state through ungovernable passions. But here we have Heathcliff begging Cathy not to be at rest, not to be at peace, but to haunt him. He says that that's preferable, that madness is preferable to living in a world without her. And it's very similar to the speech that Cathy made to Nellie back in chapter 9, about the universe becoming a mighty stranger if Heathcliff should cease to exist. And we also see Heathcliff mention his soul again as being in the grave, or lost, as if he's equating Catherine's soul with his own. He says, I cannot live without my soul. And again, Catherine had said earlier that I am Heathcliff. He's more me than I am. So from these descriptions, the word soulmate probably comes to mind. It was a term first coined by one of the British Romantic poets, Samuel Coleridge, but the idea behind the term has existed in Western canon long before that, going back to Plato's Symposium. There, we get the idea that all humans were once united with their other half, but Zeus split them apart out of jealousy, and so we all wander around looking for the missing part of ourselves. And when we actually find that other half, Plato says, we're not looking at another person at all, we're looking at a part of ourselves. And I think it's clear from the language that this is the sort of concept that Emily Bronte has in mind here. The souls of Heathcliff and Catherine seem to be the same souls, one and the same. So when Catherine's in the grave, Heathcliff's soul is in the grave. Heathcliff is more Cathy than she is. So Catherine is buried, and Heathcliff is pretty much at the lowest point in his life that he's ever been. And so Hindley, decides that now's the time to try to overpower him and kill him. He's drunk, of course, but he has his pistol, and when Heathcliff comes home from the cemetery, probably grieving and tired, Hindley bars the doors against him and prepares for a showdown. And he tries to enlist Isabella's help. They're both sitting in the parlor while Heathcliff is banging on the door. He tells her that they both have a debt to settle with Heathcliff, and that he'll be the ruin of them both if they don't stand up for themselves. But as much as she hates her husband, Isabella can't bring herself to assist in murdering him. Remember that she's been brought up in polite society, and I guess in polite society you don't murder people. She does throw a few taunts his way, however, as he's trying to break in, which only infuriates him the more. Isabella is kind of like Catherine in that she lacks the strength to inflict pain on someone physically, so she resorts to other methods. Catherine hurt others by hurting herself, and Isabella uses taunts and mockery. One of the things about this book is that everyone is trying to hurt someone else, even if they resort to different tools from the traditional way of doing so. Well, Hindley's last stand doesn't work out too well for him. Heathcliff breaks in, beats him to a bloody pulp, and then he goes to bed. He clearly doesn't take the threat of Hindley all that seriously, probably because he knows that he can handle him and he has him under his power. And this is actually one of the reasons that Hindley is so angry. He's bankrupted not only himself, but he's lost his son's inheritance by borrowing money from Heathcliff to gamble with. He's pawned off not only his money, but his property to Heathcliff. And this is what he means when he says that killing Heathcliff would be an act of justice for Hareton, for his son. The next morning, Isabella runs away, and that's the last we see both of her and of Hindley. She goes to London and writes to Nellie that she's given birth to a son, and Hindley, apparently, drinks himself to death and dies on the floor. Nellie hears this news from the doctor, and she weeps for him as if he were her brother. We know that she had a close friendship with him when they were children, despite her being the servant and Hindley being the master. And now she's the only one around to mourn for him. She suspects foul play, and she looks into the matter, but can't prove anything. The situation is left ambiguous to us, the readers, as well. Heathcliff says that he found Hindley on the floor and sent Joseph for the doctor, and Joseph, he makes the offhand comment that he wasn't dead yet when he left, but when they got back he was. So it's kind of up to us as the readers to decide if Hindley either died from alcohol poisoning, or if Heathcliff, even if Hindley was already dying, helped him along in his last moments by, smothering him with a pillow, something like that. Then we get a passage where Nellie makes a comparison between Hindley Earnshaw and Edgar Linton. She's describing how Edgar comes out of his grief and despondency for Catherine's death by tending to his newborn daughter, whereas Hindley neglected Hareton and turned to the bottle to deal with his own grief after his wife died. She says, "I used to draw a comparison between him and Hindley Earnshaw, and perplex myself to explain satisfactorily why their conduct was so opposite in similar circumstances. They had both been fond husbands, and were both attached to their children, and I could not see how they shouldn't both have taken the same road, for good or evil. But, I thought in my mind, Hindley, with apparently the stronger head, has shown himself sadly the worse and weaker man. When his ship struck, the captain abandoned his post, and the crew, instead of trying to save her, rushed into riot and confusion, leaving no hope for their luckless vessel. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. One hoped, and the other despaired. They chose their own lots and were righteously doomed to endure them." So, I think that this is such an interesting passage because it highlights how important it is to have our affections or our loves set in their proper place when we come to difficult, stormy times in life. Hindley, like Heathcliff, has turned his wife into an idol. She was all that he lived for, and when she was lost, he despaired of the future and had no reason to go on living. Edgar, on the other hand, though we see that he truly did love Catherine, never let her supplant the role of God in his heart. He never let her become the be-all, end-all of his existence. Now, Heathcliff and Cathy both looked down on Edgar's type of love just because of that. They sneered at it. They called it weak. But we see that in the end, it's his type of love that endures, and their type of love that leads to madness and despair. It's a mistake that I think is still repeated today in romance movies and in love songs, that if you love someone, you should give your heart over to them completely. And although this sounds attractive and virtuous, it isn't entirely right. You can love your significant other more than yourself. You can even give your life for theirs. But it's important to remember that in addition to being a lover, whether a husband or a wife, you've still got to be a father, a mother, sister, friend, a guardian, and a lot of other things. Life throws a lot of roles at us, with different responsibilities for each role. And to let any one role consume our attention entirely is to be out of harmony with life and with God's will for us. So a good way of keeping this harmony in perspective is to remember that all of those roles are subservient to our chief role, which is to live in a way that glorifies God. This is because God is going to be the one constant in life. A husband or wife can die, brothers and sisters and all the others can die, and if that's all that we're living for, then we're lost when we lose them. But if we're living for God, then even in our darkest moments, life is still going to have meaning. It's still going to have purpose. So there's a verse of scripture that I think a lot of people have a tough time with because it comes off as kind of a shocking thing and a little bit callous. I've heard a preacher say that it's one of the most difficult verses to handle in the New Testament, actually, for him personally, and I think for a lot of other people too. But I think that in light of what we've been saying here, it makes sense. So it's in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 14, at verse 26. Jesus Christ says this. He says, "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now, the reason that this is kind of a shocking passage is because it sounds like he's telling us to hate everyone. But this doesn't mean, or it's not saying that we should develop a hatred for our family members in order to be good disciples of Jesus Christ. What it means is that weighed in the balance between living for God and resting our confidence and strength in Him, our other affections, even those nearest and dearest to us, like our affections for our mother, our father, our brother, our sister, so on, should count for naught. And this isn't God trying to deprive us of those bonds altogether, but to warn us that those bonds aren't as constant, aren't as stable, and aren't as fulfilling as our bond with Him can be. And that's why Hindley's ship sinks, and Edgar stays afloat, according to Nellie. Edgar trusts to God. He remembers that he has duties as a father, and it gives him the will to carry on with life. So anyway, they bury Hindley, and Heathcliff reveals that he's not satiated with revenge yet. It wasn't enough for him to financially ruin his old enemy. He wants to mentally and spiritually ruin his son. He wants to degrade Hareton to the same ignorant state that Hindley had degraded him to when they were younger. Nellie persuades Edgar to try to get Hareton removed from Heathcliff's care, but Heathcliff says, "Well, if you take the boy, I know where I can find another one, and I'll go for him." referring to his son that Isabella has had. So Edgar relents. He cares more about Isabella's son than he does about Hareton, even though he's not really been around either of them. And Heathcliff is now left in possession of Hareton, as well as of Wuthering Heights itself. So now we go through a time jump in the novel. 12 years pass, and Nellie describes young Cathy's childhood and her own hand at watching after her and raising her. Edgar is wholly devoted to her, even though he's still a rather sad man now, something of a hermit. And they seem to be getting on pretty happily. This is the cheerful section of the novel, we might call it. Then Edgar gets a letter from Isabella that says that she's dying. He travels to London to meet her, and pretty soon he writes back to say that he's coming home with his nephew and with young Cathy's cousin, who's named Linton. This is Linton Heathcliff. So this nephew, this young man, he's described as effeminate, sickly, and frail. Cathy, because she's grown up a lonely child, still gushes over him anyway. She takes to feeding him his tea, petting his head, treating him like a pet. He's her new doll, her plaything, right? And while other young boys might get annoyed at that treatment, they might say, "Get off me, leave me alone." This is the sort of thing that Linton actually likes. And so it seems like they're going to get along well with each other. He likes to be babied. But on the very same night that they get home to the Grange, they get word from Heathcliff that he wants his son to live with him at the Heights, now that the mother is dead. Edgar doesn't really have much of a choice here, since Heathcliff is the father after all, and so they reluctantly send Linton off to the Heights, where none of them believe that he will be too happy or thrive. And why does Heathcliff really want Linton? It's clear right away that from his appearance to his name, he hears that the child's been named Linton and he sneers. So it's clear that he despises his son. But he knows that Linton, remember, is in line to inherit Edgar's estate, because the property passes to the male. Edgar had a daughter, but not a male child. So if he dies, Isabella's male child will get the estate. Heathcliff still wants to be revenged on Edgar in the same way that he was revenged on Hindley. And the best way for him to do that is through proxy, through his son becoming the master of Thrushcross Grange. And then, now that he sees how puny Linton is, he knows that he can persuade his son to make him the successor, the reverse of the usual role that the son inherits from the father. He's going to try to browbeat Linton into making the father the heir to the son. So Heathcliff is still plotting and scheming after 12 years have gone by. And next week we'll see his plans coming to pass even more. For next week, read Volume 2, Chapters 7 through 15. Or if your edition says chapters 21 through 29, read that. Thanks.